Awesome. Okay, so welcome everyone to day 3 of US CATS and today's keynote address. So I want to tell a quick story before we get started. So people are still trickling in, so it's okay if they miss my story. But so I'm thinking back to about a year ago this time, or maybe a year and a month ago, and it was the start of summer, and I was trying to think about how I was going to advise my 6 research students over Zoom because that's not something I had done before. And I was really worried about them feeling disconnected, right? Just sitting behind a computer screen by themselves all summer, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 10 weeks. And so I decided, okay, let's do a data book club. And I ended up opening it up to all of the faculty, staff, students, and alums from my institution. And at Miles' suggestion, the first book we read was Data Feminism. And I will tell you that is the antidote to feeling disconnected. We had wonderful conversations reading this book, and I learned so much about how I maybe am conceptualizing data science wrong and better ways to do it. So also, it was really productive and concrete ways of being better. And so I just had to get the authors of this book to talk to all of us. So I will now not pretend that they are not in the room while I tell you this story. And I will introduce the people who are going to speak to us today. So it is the authors of the book, Data Feminism. So our 2 keynote speakers are Lauren F. Klein from Emory University and Catherine Ignacio from MIT. So I'm super excited for them to be here and for us to learn from them. Remember, folks, that if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A, not the chat. So keep up the happy chatter in the chat. But if you have questions that you want us to get to at the end, put them in the Q&A and then vote for the ones that you want to make sure that we get to. All right, without further ado, I'll hand it over to our speakers. Thanks, Catherine and Lauren, for being here, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kelly, and thanks to everyone for the invitation to be here with you all today. We know that your Zoom time is precious, so we really appreciate that you showed up for this today, spend a little bit of summertime here with us. So I'm going to share screen. Oh, great. And I'll just make it so I can see the people. Great. So yeah, I don't think we need to really do introductions of ourselves, since that was a really nice introduction for us. Maybe just to say where we're headed today is Lauren and I want to tell you a little bit about data feminism, about our motivations for writing data feminism. We're going to ground you in the definition and like the specific type of feminism that we are drawing from in the book. And then we want to show you some of the examples that come out of the book and sort of illustrate these principles that we've come up with. So that's the roadmap for today. And we love questions. We probably won't be able to monitor the chat, but like we love vibrant chats as well. That was something we tried to facilitate in our own book club when we ran a book club. And so if anybody wants to be posting links or related work to be checking out, we would totally welcome that. Yeah, and I think the only last thing to say on this particular slide is that the book is open access. So you can buy the book, and of course we support that. It's a beautiful book, and we have a lot of really nice color, data visualization, images, and things like that. But you can also read the book for free online, and you just go to the URL on this slide, and then you'll see a big button that says read the book, and that will take you right to the open access version of the book. So yeah, so I think without further ado, I'll kick it over to Lauren, and she can get us started.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And I will just echo Catherine in saying thank you for being here in month 19 or 20. I've stopped counting of the pandemic. That's terrific. My 3-year-old is here too, presenting, featured speaker. And I'll just begin by saying that get the brakes. Oh, on the chair. Yeah, no, I'm not going to swivel my chair around right now. That's bad Zoom practice. So we see feminism really as part of a larger and growing body of work that is collectively working to hold corporate and government actors accountable for their sexist, racist, and classist data products. So you could think of things like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, and more. And really, you know, every day there is yet another example of this type of system. And I just want to do a shout out to some of the other projects that have done work on some of the particular algorithms that I've just mentioned and really inspired us to write the book. Because really these examples just keep on coming, and therein lies our motivation. You know, corporations, we tend to hear this phrase, data is the new oil. When this is used, corporations tend to mean this in a good way. And that data is to them the sort of untapped natural resource that if you can figure out how to process it and refine it, it can lead to tremendous profit for them. But women, and particularly women of color, as well as immigrant communities, indigenous folks, LGBTQ folks, and more, experience this very same process of data extraction, because that's really the operative metaphor here. If you're talking about oil, it's really just yet another example of the same old oppression. And we are by no means the first ones to have made the case that this oppression is real, that it is ongoing, and that it's very necessary to dismantle. And what we try to do in the book is explain how feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has actually been focused on this precise question, on dismantling instances of oppression and the forces of power that cause them for a very, very long time.
And yet, you know, so speaking out against this same old oppression carries consequences. And we see that in this very high profile case, which some of you may have been following already, which is about Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was until recently the co-lead of ethical artificial intelligence at Google. So she's really well known for her scholarship in machine vision, as well as her work on diversity and equity issues in the field of AI. She's in fact one of the founders of Black in AI, which is a community for Black researchers in artificial intelligence. So to make a long story short, leadership at Google had approved a paper that she and her team had been working on for months. And then it was approved to go into this particular conference. And then all of a sudden, Google reversed its decision and told the team to retract the paper. And it was the paper itself, you can read a summary of it. The MIT Technology Review read the paper and summarized it, but it's basically about the dangers of large language processing models from a bias perspective, like a racial bias perspective, from an environmental perspective, and a couple other things. So an interesting paper and contribution, and still quite unclear why Google wanted to retract it. And so when Dr. Gebru asked for transparency as to why, why they had demanded this retraction, the Google turned around and promptly fired her. And so, in fact, this was a very high-profile case. This has gotten a lot of attention and continues to get a lot of attention. There's a petition that was started by Google employees that was signed by 2,500 of them, and then subsequently signed by over 4,000 academics and AI researchers. Historically Black colleges and universities who do recruiting firms that recruit from historically Black colleges and universities dropped Google as a client, citing moral concerns over their treatment of Black people. And in fact, 9 members of Congress wrote a letter to Google demanding accountability about Dr. Gebru's firing. But there has been no answer about it. And this treatment is clearly, I mean, it's just sort of really egregious, high profile mistreatment. Yet 2 colleagues of mine and I, Dr. Caitlin Turner and Danielle Wood at MIT, we point out that this isn't an isolated case. So we've written a piece called the Abuse and Misogynoir Playbook that describes how, in fact, this kind of treatment is so common that it's a centuries-old playbook that is used against Black women who speak truth to power.
So I want to pose the question via in a way to sort of get back to our book. And the question is this, why does Dr. Gebru's case matter for AI and for the field of statistics? And the answer is that feminism, as both theory and practice, really demands that we ask what we call in the book who questions. So data science by whom, data science for whom, data sets about whom, data science with whose values. And so you might sort of be wondering, why are these feminist questions? And hopefully by the end of the presentation, we hope you'll understand why. But before we get started, or not before we get started, as a way to get started, we want to spend a couple of minutes just doing some level setting about how we use the term feminism in the book. So what you've been looking at here is an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards. That's Beyonce in the front. And she's up there singing about feminism and feminists because she wrote a song called Flawless, where she samples what turns out to be the American Heritage Dictionary definition of the term. So you hear in the song Beyonce say, actually it's a sample, feminist, the person who believes in equal rights for men and women, to which we add non-binary people. So what we get from this definition is that feminism is a belief in equality.
So the dictionary also gives a second definition of feminism. So it's a belief in equality for all genders. But if you believe in equality for all genders, then you just have to sort of look around in a very cursory way and understand and see very clearly that the world where all genders are equal has not yet been realized. So feminism also implies a kind of commitment to realizing that world where all genders are equal. So it's organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. So it's belief in equality, and it's political action. And then thirdly, feminism has a third definition, which is that it's a set of theories and ideas. It's a kind of an intellectual heritage. And so this part is really exciting because it means that as we are confronted daily at this point with issues of algorithmic bias and bias in data sets and training sets and benchmarking sets and so on and so forth, it means we don't have to invent things anew. Like there are really sophisticated ways of analyzing power that we inherit from the past. And one body of work is feminist scholarship. And this work began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender specifically. But then the past 40 years of scholarship and our current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and many more things.
So this brings us back around to this idea of intersectional feminism, which I mentioned when I started talking a couple of minutes ago, and how in our view, and this is what we say in the book, is that feminism in the year 2021 must be understood as intersectional. And, many of you may know intersectionality is it's a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which he uses to theorize how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, like gender. So if we're talking about inequality or oppression, we have to be talking about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. And these include racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. The one point that I want to highlight about intersectionality theoretically, because this is actually something that is often overlooked in casual invocations of the term, is that intersectionality doesn't just describe markers of individual identity. So intersectionality doesn't just mean like, okay, let's take an intersectional approach. I'm going to say I am white. I am a cisgender woman. I am a mom. It doesn't just mean these things. What intersectionality is describing studying are the structural forces of power and their intersection that make those aspects of my identity particularly salient at any particular moment, that cause the experiences of privilege on the one hand that I might experience, or the instances of oppression on the other. And it really has been the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about forces of power.
Mom, open this.
I'm not going to open an umbrella right now, no. So just to sum up this little portion of the talk, intersectional feminism, which gives Catherine and me the underlying framework for our book, it isn't only about issues of gender or even only just about women. It's about power. It's about who has it and who doesn't. And in today's world, data is power. So you see this in the idea of data as the new oil, that phrase we began by talking about. You also see this, for that matter, in the idea of data as the same old oppression. And so intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. And so our argument basically is that data science really needs feminism quite badly, actually. And intersectional feminism in particular, I will close it up, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances.
Just close it up. No.
Good work, Aurora. So in writing the book, Lauren and I sort of asked ourselves what we've learned from our own schooling in feminist scholarship, our participation in various feminist communities. And we also looked across a wide variety of literatures in many fields. You know, again, one of the most exciting things about feminist work is you can find it across many different fields of both sort of scholarship and action and activism. And in particular, we were looking at fields where folks had tried to like apply a feminist approach to designing something, whether that might be legal policy or an interactive computer system or a data visualization or a map. And so from that review and our discussions, we came up with these 7 principles here. And these, for us, encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data and data science. And so there's 7 principles. The sort of important thing to say here is this is also how the book is organized. So there's a chapter corresponds to each of these principles. And what we do in each chapter is we try to not assume that folks know anything about either data or about feminism. And so we try to introduce the reader to some of the feminist thinkers that have provided the basis for that principle, as well as to showcase some of the both historical and contemporary work of data scientists, data activists, and so on, who are actually sort of mobilizing data in these more emancipatory ways. We try to show examples of these principles sort of in action as well. And we won't have time to probably go through every single principle today, but maybe just the important thing to highlight is that you'll see that we have the first 2 principles, and in fact, the first 2 chapters of the book, again, center on this question of power. So this examine power and challenge power are these first really 2 core principles. And that, again, comes back to our reliance on intersectional feminism with its focus on power as kind of the central sort of analytic. And so folks will often ask us in some of these talks, you know, why isn't data feminism, why isn't just good data science? Because like most data scientists, they already know like we need to consider context and things like this, right? That's great if like folks already know that, that's good. But then the thing that really distinguishes data feminism from a kind of good mainstream data science are these first 2 principles. It's this really central focus on power, meaning a focus on social inequality as being one of the main sort of forces that infiltrates and infects our data pipeline at every stage of the process, and being really clear about when and where that happens and how we can push back on that, challenge that, and dismantle that. So the goal here with this set of principles was to really try to operationalize feminism for data science. So to be really kind of like utilitarian about it and say, well, how do we use feminism to do better data science? To provide models that might guide the work of people who are already working with data, to people who want to work with data, or also to people who want to refuse to work with data. And there's the refusal is important in today's day and age, where we're seeing all these technologies come out, which frankly just shouldn't exist. So where we're going to go from here is we're going to sort of pick out some of the principles from the book and show you some of the projects that we highlight along the way as a way of illustrating those principles. So here, I'll turn it back to Lauren.
Great. So one of the projects we talk about pretty early on in the book is this one. It's called The Library of Missing Datasets, and it's by the artist and educator Mimi Onuoha. So missing datasets is this term coined by Onuoha to describe datasets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but because of various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So data sets like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime. There's no national comprehensive database about this because the government is not invested in creating it. A more topical sort of example that I think is widely prevalent to all of us and obvious as missing, or any number of data sets relating to COVID, right? A race and gender breakdown of vaccine distribution across the United States. Some states are doing this, some states are not. We do not have a national comprehensive data set about this. So just to back up a little bit and say, so Onuoha exhibits the library of missing data sets in two ways. So the first is as a GitHub repository. That's actually what you're seeing on the right of the slide. That's just a screenshot from it. You can Google it and find it. In addition to the list of missing data sets there's also a very beautiful and compelling artist statement that I would recommend all of you taking a look at. But the other way in which this is presented is as a physical artwork. That's the file cabinet that you see on the left. And the idea is that the files are labeled with each of the titles of the missing data sets, and you tab through them as you would any file folder as you find one that piques your interest or you want to learn more about, and then you open the folder, but it's empty, right? And again, the reason why they're empty is because of really this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today, right? This imbalance of power is what determines what data are collected and what data are not, or in turn, what research is conducted and what research is not. So, again, to ask a who question, who has this power? Governments have this power, moneyed institutions have this power. Generally speaking, minoritized groups do not. And so this is why, to underscore the point that Catherine was making just a minute ago, a feminist approach to data science must begin with an analysis of power, because far too often the data sets that we can access, and then in turn the questions that we prompt, or rather the questions that they prompt to us, have already been affected by the imbalance of power in the world. They overdetermine our research in ways that we may or may not be aware of.
So this next project comes out of the second chapter, which is about challenging power. And this project has to do with the topic of feminicide in Mexico. So for those who may not know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. Feminicide has actually been criminalized. So there are policies about feminicide in 18 Latin American countries, including in Mexico. And largely that's thanks to the Latin American feminist movement, who has really put this issue at the top of their agenda. And if folks want to follow this, you can go look at the hashtag Ni Una Menos to see sort of how the social media presence of this movement is unfolding. But however, despite the fact that many countries at this point have criminalized feminicide, the state still does not systematically collect data about the problem, nor have they really fully implemented policies because they haven't actually trained folks like law enforcement or medical examiners to properly classify, sort of investigate and classify deaths as feminicide. And so frustrated by this, Maria Salguero, who is a sort of independent Mexican person, she's like that, she even says she doesn't consider herself an activist. In 2015, she decided to sort of head straight towards the problem of missing data and collect the data herself. And so she started collecting, and she's now been collecting for over 5 years. And ultimately, she has actually amassed sort of single-handedly the largest public archive of feminicides in Mexico. The way that she does this is fairly manual. So she spends 2 to 4 hours a day reading news reports about violent deaths of women and girls and logging those on a Google map that she, and in a spreadsheet behind the Google map that she pulls from these reports. So you can imagine this is not, it's not pleasant work to be doing. But because she has sort of assembled this database, she shares her data very freely with folks. She's ended up helping families locate loved ones who have gone missing. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs for analysis. And she's actually also testified in front of Mexico's Congress about this, about her database and the issue multiple times. And so in the book, we frame this as what you might call feminist counter data. So it's a kind of an activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this feminist counter data represents one way to use data to challenge power. And so then there is an important caveat here, though, in this work. Like, while Salguero's work is a really, I think, compelling and powerful example of how this can help to raise awareness and quantify the scope and the scale of missing data, it's important to say that, like, not every social problem can be solved by collecting more data. And in fact, often not collecting data is the most ethical choice in certain cases where, it's again this thing of like, when do the who questions, we have to always and continually be asking these who questions, because by collecting data, particularly about marginalized or vulnerable people, we may in fact be rendering them visible to states, to corporations, to agencies that may want to target and harm them, right? So it's important to think about when do we collect counter data, or when do the potential harms of counter data sort of exceed the potential benefits?
So a lot of projects that we talk about in the book actually begin as counter data collection efforts, largely due to the things we've been talking about already, that oftentimes these issues that we would like to address with data are not issues that have been attended to by these large and powerful corporations who might collect data on them. But I'm actually going to talk about this project in the context of another principle, which has to do with embracing pluralism. So what you're looking at here is a map created by the San Francisco-based anti-eviction mapping project. And excuse me, since 2013, the AEMP has worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and other community groups in the Bay Area in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis there, which is happening for obvious reasons, like the incursion of big tech salaries, making landlords recognize that they can charge much higher rents to anyone employed by Silicon Valley that cannot be paid by anyone who is employed by pretty much anyone else. In any case, more specifically, what you're looking at here on the map, each red dot indicates a place where a person or a family was evicted, and the blue dots indicate a place where the AEMP has also interviewed one of those people. So if you click on one of the blue dots, you get one of these video interviews, like the one that we've screenshotted here. This is of Phyllis Bowie, a Midtown resident who is being evicted from her home. And I think the contrast that I want to draw is it's a really important one for statistics. So we can contrast the map that you were just looking at with this one. This is the work of the Eviction Lab, which is based out of Princeton. And the Eviction Lab's goal, you may already be familiar with it, is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis, right? So very related to the work of the AEMP. And I should say, before I get into the comparison, this is in itself a worthy goal, and it's a really valuable project, but it's wildly different in terms of process, with real implications for the kinds of information that are conveyed. So you might look at this map or, read any one of their papers and think, okay, I think I'm looking at bigger data, right? At the least I'm looking at a map of the whole United States. It must be giving me a more comprehensive picture. You might also look at just the tools they use and think, oh, I think this is a little bit more scientific or rigorous, right? They're using Mapbox to make their maps. The AEMP, at least for that map, was using just Google Maps or some sort of equivalent, I can trust this one more. But interestingly and meaningfully, the AEMP has shown that the national real estate databases that the Eviction Lab uses significantly undercount evictions. And you can think for a minute again about why this might be true. Anyone who has ever been sort of de facto evicted from their home by the landlord, raising your rent so that it's too high that you can't pay it, refusing to fix that leak in your ceiling so it becomes very annoying to live there, lurking in your lobby so that you feel harassed. Like, these are all techniques that landlords can use to get you out of your home without actually going to City Hall and filing the paperwork for a legal eviction that then becomes recorded in this national data set. And obviously, the real estate industry, which is creating this data set, they are not incentivized to count any more evictions than they have to. That would invite certainly bad press and potentially even harmful for them oversight, right? So there's a mismatch in terms of values and interest here. But because the AEMP, because they work with local community groups, so the places where individuals and families go and say, like, help me, this is happening to me. And they've developed a system to catalog these reports as data so that they can then be analyzed. What the AEMP has developed is actually more contextualized data, more complete data, and data that actually documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And so this is really what can be gained by embracing pluralism. Sometimes it leads to a messier process and certainly messier data, but ultimately you have a more fine-grained and more contextualized sense of the issue it is that, in theory, at least all of us are invested in exploring.
So that example is about this, this principle of embracing pluralism, which really, what that means is embracing a kind of a participatory process for data science, for working with data. But then this does beg the question, because, if you are, let's say, building a software system that is then going to be deployed sort of at scale, you can't necessarily bring like every single user who you might be potentially reaching to the table as part of the design process. And so whose voices do we prioritize as a part of this participatory process? And so feminist approach to design has a really kind of clear answer to this. So following the work of Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill-Collins, Xiaowen Barzel, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and centers the experiences and the participation of people at the edges and margins first and foremost. So thinking about how do we make design decisions and build something that works from the outside in, from the margins to the center. And so that's sort of what you see. This is just more of like a hypothetical histogram here. In some system that you're building, like typically what happens is like, we're like, oh, okay, by, following these couple of things, we can meet the needs of, let's say, like 80% of the users. And that seems pretty good, right? Whereas in fact, what a feminist approach to design would say is like, no, we're going to look to these edges, we're going to see sort of who's going to be most marginalized or stands the potential to be most harmed by this. And those are the folks that we are going to bring into the process. We're going to pay them for participating. We're going to build relationships, like real, true, authentic relationships with them, and listen to them as experts in terms of thinking about how do we design a system that works for everybody. And this is something that's very in line. I don't know if folks here have seen, there's a great book out by Sasha Costanza-Chalk that's called Design Justice. This is also very in line with the book and the larger community and network of design justice. And they say, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. And so certainly, especially as statistics and AI and machine learning kind of move into kind of the more human aspects of our everyday lives. So thinking about things like allocating healthcare, social services, and all of these things, we need to be thinking really clearly about sort of who stands to be harmed and who stands to benefit from these systems, and thinking about how do we include their voices in the process of design. So till now, the previous examples have focused more on issues of power and people. So people who have power and people who don't. But then another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power, and in particular to binary structures. So there's a kind of long thread of feminist work that critiques binaries, and in particular drawing from the gender binary. And so this is related to our principle in our chapter in the book, which is to rethink binaries and hierarchies. And so feminist theorists kind of take the gender binary as like the quintessential example of binary thinking. And they say, well, in fact, there's really two problems with the gender binary. So first of all, it's like you have this received wisdom that there are men and there are women. That's first of all false, right? Like it's just empirically false that there are only two genders. And so first of all, the first critique of binaries is that they're often excluding and erasing other categories, particularly like identity, but this could apply to other things that are not people as well. So what happens when we're kind of binarizing things is we may be excluding things that are really important categories. So first of all, binaries could be false. And then there's a second problem with binaries is that they're often hiding hierarchies. So if we have this received idea that there's men and there's women, in fact, they're not like on an equal playing field. Men are up here and women are here, right? So binaries are excluding important categories, and they're often hiding hierarchies as well. And so one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to kind of take this critique of the gender binary and then to use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So these would be things like nature and culture, or subject and object, or what this next example takes up is this artificial distinction between reason on the one hand and emotion on the other hand.
Thanks, Catherine. So that was an amazing sort of theoretical framework for this next example that I want to talk through. And it has to do with data visualization and how in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that sort of rational, objective data visualizations, these are somehow better than those that engage the emotions. And we see this play out, all the time. So best practices for data visualization, you can think about it. They involve a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, presenting only the facts. But the question remains, why are these our best practices and our only best practices, especially when research in the field of data visualization has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. So we tend to believe that these sort of minimal, stripped down kind of charts are more truthful than they actually are. So you could think of research by Jessica Holman, who has shown that just including a source line below a data visualization makes a person trust that visualization more. Doesn't matter whether the credit line actually describes or links to a real source or not. There's been really interesting work recently by Crystal Lee and a team at MIT that looks at the visualizations that are used on social media by spreaders of COVID misinformation. And what she and her team found is that spreaders of COVID misinformation actually mobilize these minimalist, seemingly objective visual typologies to accompany their totally made up data, because they know that they carry this aura of objectivity, what you see on this slide. But I want to flip this around here and ask about the opposite. So what about visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion, that say, okay, this is another tool that we can use. How do we do it effectively? And this is what this next example helps us explore. So what you're looking at here, it's actually a screenshot of an animated visualization. It's by the design firm Periscopic. If you go to the URL that's up at the top left, you can actually watch it as I'm talking. And what you would see is a visualization of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a particular calendar year. And so what happens in the visualization is each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single arc. The arcs are traced one by one on the screen. They start at orange, that's the person's life. And when they were killed, then the arc becomes gray. And they actually, the part of what the visualization does is predict their estimated lifespan had they not been killed by a gun at that moment in time. The arcs, they start out slow, but then they get faster and faster until they create this sort of semicircular web that you see in the larger image. And it's really overwhelming to watch. It becomes almost unbearable. Like, you think it should be done. You think there couldn't possibly be more people who have died, but it keeps on going. It goes on for a really, really long time. And that's really the point. There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States. There's too many being killed. That means that there's too many to plot on this particular visualization. It also means there's too many to visualize. And I should have noted, this is actually a rhetorical feature of the AEMP map that I was talking about earlier. It employs a technique called occlusion, which in visualization means like the data points, you can't see the points behind other points, they're occluded. And in general, that's a bad thing. Like, the goal, one would think, is to be able to identify the individual points so that you can figure out where they're plotted and what their significance is. But both here and in the AEMP map, they use occlusion to make a point, right? There are too many dots on the map. The data points are occluded because there are too many people being killed by guns in the United States, right? Like, this is yet another epidemic. So just methodologically speaking, it's no less statistically sound than any other study, right? So the data about the people come from a national crime data set. It comes from a website, crimes.gov. I don't know if you've ever looked into that, but that exists. It's a whole thing. The projected lifespans come from a model released by the World Health Organization, which is informed by, decades of data collection, qualitative research, modeling, everything. But nevertheless, this project was viewed with intense suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel things. Now, a feminist approach here would say that's not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. And actually, it's a more compelling and effective visualization because it blends reason with emotion. It rejects this binary that we need to make a choice between reason and emotion. It rejects the hierarchy that rational presentation of data is better than an emotional presentation of the data when the aim is to convince or compel. And what happens when you open yourself up to this possibility of rebalancing reason and emotion, it opens up the data communication toolbox to really let you focus on what actually matters with any of these types of projects, which is honoring the context of the data, listening to the experience that's embedded in the data, and taking action in your small way to challenge these imbalances of power that we encounter in the world.
So if it isn't already apparent, the principles of data feminism apply really to every stage of a data science project, from inception and funding, which you might argue are maybe the most important phases of the project, because when you sort of where you get your money from and who's leading the project are in fact factors that really, really, really matter in terms of whether a project can really realize feminist values and ethics, I would say. But then even beyond that, of course, is sort of thinking about there are all of these ways in which these forces of power, forces of inequality shape the project at every stage. So they shape the research questions that are asked, the way that data are collected, from whom, how it's processed, analyzed, deployed, so on and so forth. And so it's sort of really we need to be thinking it's sort of simultaneously. It's not just about kind of doing like the, a great analysis or something. It's sort of like all of it. It's comprehensive across the whole timeline and pipeline of the project. And that brings us to really just the final point before we open up to Q&A. This may be very obvious from the examples that we've shown so far, but it's worth saying again that data feminism really requires an expanded definition of data science and an expanded definition of sort of who is a data scientist. So our data science isn't defined by the size of the data set. It's not defined by the credentials of the people undertaking the work. These concerns are continually used to exclude people of color and women from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is really socio-technical rather than just purely kind of technical or methodological. But so if we expand our definition of data science and expand our definition of who counts as a data scientist, and what we're interested in is sort of data science and justice, then we can really see clearly that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, librarians, community organizers, and activists. And some of this work does look like traditional data science. And so like, there's work by Margaret Mitchell, for example, and her team at Google, who they've done, she's the co-lead of the group with Dr. Gebru. She was also incidentally fired, but she has a fantastic career of doing really important work about bias and natural language processing techniques. But then next to her work is a data-driven sculpture. So it's actually like an AI-driven chatbot that you can walk up to. It's created by the artist Stephanie Dinkins, and the chatbot was trained on only the kind of data set that consisted of Stephanie's conversations with 3 generations of her in her family of Black women. So it answers you sort of as a member of Stephanie's family when you ask it questions. And then on the right, there's many contributions by data journalism. Data journalism is doing some really interesting work in this space. And then finally on the bottom here is what data therapy, this group calls a data mural, where they work with community-based organizations to do data-driven murals and infographics in their communities. So we have hundreds of examples like this in the book, which we illustrated. We selected to illustrate our points, to inspire readers to action, to say like, this is not impossible to do the, to use these principles. It's not impossible to do this differently. Because, while we recognize, data is at the root of many problems today, or kind of is an output of these structural forces of oppression in many cases. At the same time, it can also be part of the solution. And so just a kind of aside, we were invited to put Data Feminism, the book, in a couple of exhibitions, and it wasn't really clear how you exhibit a book. So we worked with an amazing designer and illustrator, Marcia Diaz, and we created these infographics. And then there's some also postcards that go along with these. And we have those available for download if folks are interested on our website. And we actually have many languages. We have 5 languages right now, and then we're going to be releasing more languages this summer, so stay tuned for that. And that's all we've got. We are really looking forward to hearing questions and talking further with folks, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Lauren. When we're in the Zoom webinar format, it is very hard to clap, but if folks could figure out a way in the chat to clap for our speakers. Thank you so much. All right, so we've got some questions that have definitely been coming in. So I'm just gonna start with the top most voted question. Okay, so how do we bring along white males as you push back against the pervasive exclusion of marginalized people? women, BIPOC, non-cisgender from much of the assumptions that underline research, data, etc. I even see some obstruction / blindness in the wording of some questions here.
Yeah, this is a super important question. And one of the things we talk about a lot in the book is that ultimately, there's a feminist principle, I would say, of this idea of co-liberation. And this is something that means that oppressive systems harm all of us. And so I benefit from whiteness, I benefit from being white, but ultimately I'm also harmed by white supremacy because I am disconnected from people of color. I am brought into a system that is enacting harm on a daily basis in all these, kind of both interpersonal and structural ways. And so I think the key thing to think about here is sort of how are we called into our privilege when we do embody these dominant identities, such as whiteness or males, men, etc. Sort of how do we think about both reflect on how we're harmed by those, and kind of that we're harmed even as we benefit, but also how do we take responsibility for that, and sort of call white people into their privilege, call men into their privilege, and really see that our work is bound together. It's not the work only of people of color to dismantle white supremacy, right? Like we say in the book too, it takes more than one gender to have gender inequality. So we really need men at the table believing that's true and really wanting to be present and working to dismantle harmful systems of gender oppression, right? It's as much men's responsibility, arguably more, than women's responsibility, and similarly sort of with people and so on and so forth. And so so yeah, I think I understand the question because I do think when folks are new to some of these ideas, they can feel you can feel shame, and I do feel shame sometimes as a white person of this. I don't want to be part of this system, and I am in these many ways, and I think that is okay. But what's important is to help people come out of their shame and begin the work of moving forward, sort of in partnership and together. And so, to the extent that you can frame that as a kind of I think responsibility, and also model. This is the importance too of where how say you're a white man and you're in front of the classroom, how do you model that behavior for the other white men as well? Your authority and your voice can be just really important in the ways that you yourself sort of show up for women or show up for people of color, women of color, etc. So yeah, Lauren, I don't know if you have other.
No, that was a really amazing answer. I think the only thing that I will add to this is there's a line from the Black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins that we actually quote in the book that I actually tell to my students on the first day of any class that engages with these types of issues. And it is, there are very few pure victims and there are very few pure oppressors. And I think that that's a really important framework too, because I feel like when I say that to my students in these somewhat charged scenarios where the men students are thinking oh God, I'm so terrible, or the white students are thinking, oh God, I'm so terrible. If you hear that and you think about it, I first of all can see my students sigh with relief that I am not singling out people on the basis of their dominant presenting identity characteristic, but also because it's true, right? We can all think of instances in our lives when we have experienced a situation in which we experienced oppression, or where we were victimized in some way. And we can also probably also point to instances where we experience privilege. And I think recognizing that these lessons, they may be focused on what are the most pressing instances of oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other, in a US context, really, racism and sexism. But they hold lessons for all of us. And they're also things that we can all relate to, right? And so that's the only thing that I would add to Catherine's really amazing response.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll note that something that was powerful for me when I read Catherine and Lauren's book is they were very upfront about some of their different identities. And I think I took that and then in my class talked to my students the first day of class a little bit about identity and that we have some that people can see and some that people can't. And that seemed to help them feel a little bit more comfortable recognizing how complicated power structures are. Okay, so actually very related to that same point. Allison Thiebold had a question. So today, luckily, nearly every department, college, school has a DEI committee. I found that often the conversations of these committees surround the use of social justice data sets, but lack the bigger reflection of how power is distributed in the classroom. What recommendations would you make to departments considering issues of DEI as they relate to data feminism?
Want to go first?
Oh, no, it's okay. No, this is such a good question. And I feel like in many ways, it's the question that especially like white allies are grappling with right now, right? And I just will begin by saying, like, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think that it's really important to think about this question because it's, you know, it's open, right? There is not a great approach here. But I do think that continually trying to connect this desire for words and speaking aloud and sort of performative expressions of commitments to inclusivity, continuing to insist that they be attached to action. Like, you know, how does not just the hiring, but also the support for faculty of color work in your institution? Like, does retention match this commitment you're saying to hiring? And if not, how? How are we defining and evaluating excellence both in research and in teaching, right? Like, what are the quality and service too, right? What are the things that traditionally institutions have valued? What are the things that DEI initiatives, in order to be backed by action, like what additional demands do they require? And is there space in the evaluation rubrics for these things to be valued and recognized for, like, not just, you know, like to be counted, but actually to truly inherently be valued? Questions of, I mean, I think even in the classroom, right, thinking about, you know, how are we assessing what the students are learning? What things are like, what is this, you know, and I think this is true, like I have a joint appointment, I'm half in English and half in, it's quantitative theory and methods. We have a lot of stats people in the department, but we have a real issue with the makeup of the students in the major and even in the minor, right? And it's like, okay, well, what are the reasons for that? What are the things that we are teaching? And how might we both sort of, and this is to Catherine's closing point in our talk, sort of expand our definition of what counts in this field, of what research looks like in this field, I think in many ways, which will have a direct bearing on the types of students who feel heralded and spoken to by these courses and by the things that we are teaching. If we can connect them to these social issues, I do think that towards improving these DEI efforts in practice, not just in theory. But that also means, you know, I think grappling within our departments, again, about these questions about what counts, like what is statistics, what is part of the core requirements, what is an elective, what gets baked into the curriculum. I mean, these are structural questions at the level of the curriculum, at the discipline, the university. But these are the types of changes that are required in order to back these initiatives with actual action.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we'll have one more question, even though there's a nice stream of them. Okay, so suggestions for good classroom data sets for smashing the gender binary that include enough data for meaningful analysis of subgroups beyond just male and female.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really interesting question. It's something that I've been thinking about in relation also to Native Americans, because Native Americans, proportionally speaking, are left out of so many types of analysis, like at the national scale, even like for COVID, or even sometimes in like counter data projects. So for example, there's a database of people killed in police violence that's compiled by the Washington Post. And we were interviewing a Native American woman who collects counter data on exactly this topic, and just deeply frustrated because when they categorize race, they never put Native American, right? So just, it makes a database completely unusable for her. So I think it's an interesting problem, and it kind of goes back to this idea of like, how do we think about the folks at the margins, who may often be in a tremendously small proportion to some kind of like majority group, and so how do we center them? So I would say two resources, like one is, or three. One is the Williams Institute. So the Williams Institute does some really interesting work around LGBTQ populations. And so they have collected really interesting data sets. They've done some really interesting estimations of the transgender population in the United States. So I think that would be a really interesting place to look to focus specifically on LGBTQ folks. The second thing I was going to say, I might have lost the third, but I'll say the second one. The second thing I was going to say, and we allude to this in our book, is, you are sometimes constrained. Like we don't all have the luxury of being able to like control every stage of that pipeline that we showed, right? So we often, it's like we have gender data, but they have collected data in the binary, let's say. And so there's still steps that you can take as you kind of do some kind of gender analysis on this. So you like do what you're doing, and then when you present the data, what you can do is think about, as you both visualize and write about the data, like kind of whatever form it takes, you can just take the simple step of saying gender's not a binary, like this data set did not include non-binary genders. Or if you're depicting the data visually, you never have two categories, you have three categories or three colors or whatever you're going to do. And the non-binary category is just simply 0. And so like we show a couple of examples in the book of like, there's power in visualizing nothing, right? Because you're acknowledging that this thing exists and we don't have the data, rather than just kind of reifying the gender binary by just showing the two genders. So it's sort of like you can still take these steps to not be binary. And then, gosh, I did have a third thing. I should have written them down. Maybe it'll come back to me. Lauren, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I'm just busy putting some links in the chat. I thought it was interesting to your point about the value of, even if you've inherited a data set with binary gender, just calling it out as Catherine was speaking. And I was really interested, just a couple of days ago, Google released a data set intended to be used to benchmark or assess AI tools according to gender bias. And just in the description of the data set, they were like, look, we don't have data on non-binary gender. We know that that's like a real category in the world. We just don't have enough to make it useful. And to see, Google is not always, is rarely, a model citizen in this regard, but to see this practice being adopted at the highest levels, like within the big 5, to me actually was pretty powerful. And then I also wanted to call out this really amazing paper, actually co-authored by Dr. Gebru, who we began our talk by talking about data sheets for data sets, which really is just a series of it's like 100 different questions grouped into categories that you can ask of a data set that I actually use anytime my students do a data-driven sort of a longer term project where there's like a, data set description, analysis, things like this. I have them do this as part of the project, and you just run through the list of questions. And even sometimes, again, when the answer is like, I don't know who created the data set, or I'm not sure if the people consented to have their data in the data set or not, even just the act of asking those questions get students thinking about the types of questions that they should be thinking about all the time when they sort of pick up a data set in the wild. So that's just what I put in the chat right there.
Yeah, and in the process, I remembered the third thing, which was a paper that I put in the chat, really great paper by Brooke Foucault-Wells, who's like a network scientist at Northeastern. It's a really great sort of conceptual paper about how do we kind of recenter big data and center it on those folks who appear to be outliers in like this otherwise much larger population.
Great. Well, wonderful. Thanks so much. Thanks for your presentation, answering our questions. And folks, remember that Lauren and Catherine will be in a breakout session in 10 minutes. So if you have more questions for them, you can ask then. But also remember there are 8 other breakouts going on. So hop into the one that looks good to you. Alan, do you have any other announcements for us?
Thanks to Lauren and Catherine. See you all in the breakout sessions.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.